Hi, I'm Phileas Steyn and I'm the safari expert. And I just got back from Chitwa Chitwa in the northern Sabi Sands where I took wildlife photographs with a Canon 100 to 400mm Mark II zoom lens. Now I used to take photographs with a big 500mm f4 prime lens, but this time I decided to take something that's a lot smaller and a lot more versatile. So in this video I'm going to tell you what I liked about the lens, but also where it fell short a little bit. But before I do so, remember that I'm actually leading some photographic safaris to Chitwa Chitwa later this year for Zali Photo, and all the dates, prices and information will be in the description below. Now let's start with the things that I disliked about the lens. The first thing, it's an f5.6 lens when you're zoomed in all the way. And that means that you don't quite have that shallow depth of field that you would have with a prime lens like a 500 f4 or 300 or 400 f2.8. So as you can see from this example, at f5.6, the background isn't nearly as blurred as it would be with an f2.8 or f4 lens. Here the background is a little bit further behind the subject, but because it was again photographed at f5.6 as opposed to f4 or f2.8, the leopard doesn't quite pop so much. And the reason for that, of course, is because not only does the background not blur that much, but also the foreground is not nearly as blurry as it would be with a prime lens. Now, the only time that you are able to blur that background perfectly with a 100 to 400mm f5.6 lens is if you park the optimal distance relatively far away and then zoom in to the maximum. Here you can see that when I photograph at f5.6 and I zoom into the maximum, in other words 400mm, the background blurs beautifully. Here's another example where I did zoom in all the way and thus I was able to blur the background. Another situation where some people might feel a little bit frustrated with the 100 to 400mm zoom lens is when the subject is quite far away from you. Now that certainly wasn't a problem when we were photographing mammals now in the Sabi Sands, because as you can see, these animals would literally walk right past us. But in some cases, I did struggle a little bit to get close to the birds we were photographing. In this case, it was a hammerkop that had just caught a fish, and as you can see, he was quite small in the frame, even though I was zoomed in to the maximum. And that's why I use a Canon 5D Mark IV full-frame DSLR camera with 100 to 400, because that massive sensor just allows me to crop in without losing detail. Now the last situation where the 100 to 400mm Mark II f5.6 zoom lens let me down a little bit was at night in the spotlight. Because it lets in so much less light than an f4 or f2.8 prime lens, it means that you've got to photograph at a high ISO and a very slow shutter speed. In this case, it was ISO 6400 and an 80th of a second. Now in this case, I was able to keep the camera nice and still, so it's not blurry, but when you zoom in, you'll see that it's quite grainy because of that high ISO. In this case, I had to choose a 60th of a second to get a good exposure, but I was not able to get a sharp photograph because the line just moved its head a little bit. Had this been photographed with an f2.8 lens, I probably would have had double the shutter speed and thus a sharp photograph. Luckily, when I kept my camera dead still and the animal stood dead still, I was able to get very decent nighttime shots. You'll see here that when I zoom in, it might not be pin sharp and it is a little bit grainy, but I'm definitely happy with the result. Here's another example of a leopard in the spotlight photographed at ISO 3200 f5 at 125th of a second, and I think it looks pretty good. Now let's talk about the things that I like about this lens. Now the first thing is it's extremely light. And believe me, that makes all the difference when you're photographing something for a long time, and especially when it moves around a lot. Now in our case, one morning we were extremely lucky when we found a young female leopard that was playing in a marula tree. So she ran up the trunk of the tree, jumped from branch to branch right to the canopy. She even jumped to the tree next door and then came all the way back. Had I been photographing with my 500mm f4 lens, it would have been extremely difficult to hold it up all the time. And because there was all this movement, even the support would have been very difficult because there would have been a little bit of a space and an angle issue. With the Canon 100 to 400mm zoom lens though, it was extremely easy to handhold it and point it upwards and get all the shots I wanted without getting tired. I also find that these smaller light lenses makes it a lot easier to take panning shots, because holding those big heavy lenses and moving it back and forth can be really cumbersome. Now we were lucky, we had a few really great opportunities where leopards and wild dogs walked and ran past us, giving me some fantastic panning opportunities. And just look at this amazing result I was able to get with Canon's 100 to 400mm Mark II f5.6 lens. And for those of you that are wondering about the settings, you'll see that this was photographed in shutter priority at 1/4 of a second. And the reason for that slow shutter speed was obviously the fact that the leopard was walking very slowly, so the slower the animal moves, the slower your shutter speed needs to be. If you'd like a more in-depth explanation of how to take these wildlife panning shots, consider enrolling in my online course called Wildlife Photography for Beginners and Amateurs. In it, I cover everything from equipment, settings and light, to composition, creativity, and even animal behavior. I'll add a link to the course in the description below if you'd like to go and check it out. Now, what I love most about the 100 to 400mm zoom lens is the versatility that you get in that range of focal lengths. Let me show you what I mean. At some stage, we found a small herd of elephants that were about 20 meters away from us. Now, this was more or less what I was able to photograph at about mid-range, but the moment that I zoomed out, I could get both of the elephants in the frame. At the same time, when I zoomed in, I was able to get these great close-ups of their ears, their trunks, and their eyes, which allowed me to capture that detail and texture in their skin. Let me show you another example. At some stage, we found a pride of lions lying in the road, and you can see here that I was zoomed out almost all the way to 135mm, and it allowed me to get all the lions in the frame together with a little bit of their surroundings. When I zoomed in to 200mm, I cut out most of the surroundings, but I still got all the lions in. At 300mm, I started cutting out some of the rest of the pride, but I still got the whole body of this female in. And then when she yawned, I zoomed in all the way to 400mm, allowing me to isolate this animal specifically. Had I been photographing with a prime lens at a fixed focal length, I could only frame that scene in one way. Here's another example. At some stage, we found a pack of wild dogs in the road, and when I zoomed in, I could take these beautiful portrait photographs, and when I zoomed out, I could get these wider shots that not only included the whole pack, but also their beautiful surroundings. At some stage, that young female leopard I was talking about that jumped around in the trees settled on a beautiful branch quite close to us, and everybody else on the vehicle was photographing with f2.8 300mm prime lenses. And for them, it meant that they had to park at exactly the right distance to get the whole leopard and its tail in. Now, for me, it was quite easy because I could just zoom out a little bit if I wanted the whole leopard in, but at the same time, I could also zoom in and get a slightly tighter portrait photograph of the same animal. And it's that versatility that allows me to take beautiful wide shots, but also to zoom in and take tighter portrait shots that make this Canon 100 to 400mm Mark II f5.6 zoom lens the perfect lens for a place like the Sabi Sands. And I must admit, I really do believe that it's the sharpest f5.6 zoom lens available on the market. And that's why I use it. I don't think I'm going to go back to those big prime lenses anytime soon, so you can look forward to seeing more awesome photographs posted on Facebook and Instagram taken with Canon's 100 to 400mm f5.6 Mark II zoom lens. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments what you think, not only of the photographs that I just showed you, but of this wonderful little zoom lens. And don't forget to go and check out the description below if you want to enroll in my online course called Wildlife Photography for Beginners and Amateurs.
Mm.